Hi, Edie. Nice to see you again.
Hi, Deb. So good to see you too.
So, last week we did a video and we talked about ways to be able to support staff who are working in seniors care. And we thought this week we would shift gears and talk about, well, what families are experiencing. Those families who have loved ones in seniors care, whether it's retirement, long term care, assisted living. And as you and I like to have, we love alliteration. We've come up with three G's that we want to talk about today.
Yes, the three
The
G's.
three G's. So we'll start with the first two and we'll keep the third as a surprise.
Oh, I love that idea.
But, I know as having been a family member with my husband, my mom, and my dad, I just remember feeling completely overwhelmed with this conflict of emotions. And I write about that in my book as well. But the grief and the guilt are what I think would be really helpful to talk about today, particularly for families who aren't able to see their loved ones living in long-term care or retirement because of the restricted visitation, because of the reality of COVID-19.
That's right.
And just with all of your experience as a psychotherapist, and I'm sure having lots of conversations around grief and guilt, I think that would be a great place to start. So I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you. So I have a smile on my face only because this conversation is such a needed conversation. And it's dear to my heart because so often we don't talk about grief. We put it aside, we swallow it. And if you're a family member and you're in the predicament right now of having a family member, a loved one in a nursing home, in a nursing care facility, in senior care, the inability to see them, to touch them, to laugh with them, person to person, that human contact, it's so hard. And you might not label what you're experiencing as that family member, as a grief response. And yet it's the dilemma of grief. It's the dilemma of the experience of yearning for something that you can't have, missing your loved one, and not feeling that you have any control. And all of these add to that internal dilemma, if you will, of the grief. And if you can label it as such, what we know is the labeling of it is half the battle, because then you can bring it into conversation. You have a platform for it. And so often the grief is quieted. It's like, oh no, I better not share this. I'd better keep this quiet. So for family members, I so urge you to start the conversation.
And Edie, how would you suggest they start that conversation?
The first way to begin any conversation is to say, wow, what are the things that I'm feeling? What is my experience right now? And the experience of grief can be sleeplessness. It can feel like anxiety. It can feel like anger. And we're going to, talk about all of these things at some point. But there's also guilt.
Mm-hmm.
And that guilt is so overwhelming because you feel like I'm not doing enough. And maybe you can start with just a simple sentence of, I'm not doing enough, and share it. And that's how you can begin to talk about it. Or you can start to write it in a journal. And that journal writing is really helpful in taking what's going on inside and moving it onto paper or onto your computer and then sharing it.
Yeah, I would imagine when we hold on to those emotions, that's when physical illness can start to happen and start to manifest, right? If we're keeping everything bottled down. And sometimes it's hard to understand, like what you were alluding to, and I'm sure you speak more about it in your book, is how to know that that's grief that you're feeling. Because you're right, sometimes it comes out as anger and frustration. And certainly staff members have experienced family members lashing out at them because they're angry about something that is can be disproportionate to the situation. But it's probably, like from what you're saying, it's the grief and the guilt that is bubbling up and is just being left unexpressed.
Yes. So if we think about what the guilt reaction, how that forms, if you've got a loved one in senior care, there may be guilt just for having put them into senior care, period. And every time you walk through those doors, which obviously you can't do right now, but every time you walk through those doors, you are reminded of a decision that you had to make.
Yeah.
And that decision can leave you feeling such intense emotions around guilt. Like there's that critic. And guilt is often associated to that inner critic that says, why couldn't you keep them at home? Why couldn't you keep them in their homes? Why couldn't you quit your job and be there and be the caretaker that you always promised to them that you'd be? So you walk in those doors of that senior care home and there's a flood. Maybe it's not conscious, but your body may tighten, or your throat may tighten, or your mouth gets dry, or you get edgy and anxious. And that's all guilt.
Yeah.
And I look at things under the umbrella of grief. So it's all grief for what you weren't able to follow through on a promise made. I have a great quote that I'd love to share with you, and we've been talking about quotes. And this one is actually from a gentleman. His name is Lewis B. Smeads. And he wrote, "The difference between guilt and shame is very clear in theory. We feel guilt for what we do. We feel shame for what we are."
Wow. It's so true. And when you say that, it reminds me of when my mom finally had to place my dad in long-term care. He had Lewy body dementia, Parkinson's, falling every night. She was becoming sicker and sicker, and had a stroke about a decade and a half ago. And she kept saying to me, "But your father made me promise years ago to never put him in an old folks home." Mm. And there were lots of discussions around, and with our local LHIN, which is the governing body that funds long-term care and had a great case manager. And it was really challenging to chip through the guilt and her feeling that she had let him down by making that decision, to be able to show all of the logistical need and practicality of it. And I don't think that guilt ever went away, because that was, in that generation, there was a real, well, as there can still be now, a fear of needing to be institutionalized.
So you bring this up, and the stories, our stories, are so important. How do you think your mom dealt with her guilt?
I think, well, she ended up becoming ill and needing to live in assisted living, and she passed away last summer. I think that there was, physical manifestation of it. I think she kept a lot of that emotion to herself. And I think it created this level of sadness and melancholy, and not really being able to talk through it or get to a level of acceptance. That was the best choice for my dad and my mom at that time. And he was well cared for the 6 months that he lived in long-term care. Of course, it wasn't ideal,
right.
So, and I think sometimes as kids, we can kind of brush it off. Well, Mom, there was no other choice. We don't need to keep talking about it. Could be some of the reactions that we have out of frustration.
That's right.
Here we are again talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
And is that something that you've experienced in your practice?
Oh, sure. The guilt of surviving. There's a survivor's guilt, and that survivor's guilt, which we're actually seeing very potently with COVID-19, is, my spouse, my parent got sick, And I wasn't able to say goodbye. I wasn't able to say goodbye to my parent who's in a senior care facility, and the guilt that I wish I could have done more, or I wish that I could have not brought them there to begin with. And what we do is we swallow the guilt. And, you said your mom got sick. And what we know is when we swallow our grief, when we swallow the guilt or anger or any of the emotions, but guilt especially, it eats at you. And it's got nowhere to go, and it can affect our emotions, our emotional well-being. It can affect that depression, that mood. It can also affect our physical health, from heart issues to gut issues, especially circulation. Yeah,
I've heard it said that guilt is one of the most useless emotions. What do you think about that?
That's such an interesting quote. I don't know what I think about that. Maybe we need it as a way to redefine how we want to live. And then we move on from it. So there is a natural progression of, I wish I could have done something. And there's a difference between that momentary guilt and a guilt that becomes an obsessive conversation.
So I guess the trick is, if you're able to recognize it as a feeling of guilt and say, okay, so I clearly don't want to stay in this place.
Right.
How can I leverage this feeling and this emotion to be able to shift my focus, to be able to try to make something good out of a negative emotion, perhaps?
And yes, and actually in my book, It's Grief, I talk about how grief offers gifts. And we might not know what those gifts are, but maybe it's that you are able to get rid of your guilt, or you're able to put it in a place that it doesn't eat at you anymore. Maybe it's forming new relationships. Maybe it's learning how to be vulnerable with what is going on within your soul, within your psyche. So there are gifts within grief, and families can come together and get closer because they've lost a loved one, or because they don't know what to do with their loved one being in a senior care facility, and they can't contact them, or they can't reach them, or they can't see them and touch them. And so families are gathering and from all over the country, and they're on Zoom and they're talking to their loved one. And so what is this grief doing? It's actually creating and forming a collective and a community within the family that they might not have done.
I shared a video on my Facebook that I saw where there was families that they formed. They are all in their cars, and they did a drive-by of the nursing home to wave at the residents. And so there you have, although again, they have to keep socially distant.
Yes.
They're doing something together that makes them feel really good in sharing their gratitude. And in case people are thinking that the third G is gifts, because I saw how you slipped that in, we should be calling this the 4 Gs, right?
Yeah, probably, right?
But it's a great point as far as the gifts that we can get. And what we were thinking about the third G being was really around gratitude.
Yeah.
And how that example of those families that were able to coordinate and come together, and they were showing gratitude to the staff taking care of their loved ones, as well as being able to see their loved ones at the window. And there's a quote that I like to share as we talk about gratitude. And it's a quote that I saw that Adam Grant put on his Instagram. And he says, "Feeling grateful makes us happier. Showing gratitude makes others happier. Gratitude journals are good, but gratitude letters are better. Feeling gratitude and not expressing it is like wrapping a present and not giving it." And that last quote he's attributed to William Arthur Ward. And I thought, it'd be really interesting to talk about that difference between, feeling grateful and actually
Actively.
expressing gratitude.
Yeah. 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 It's, as you were talking about we've moved from now 3Gs to 4Gs, you know, uh, that there's grief and guilt and gratitude and gifts. And that when you give the gratitude, when you are active in the gratitude, not just saying I'm going to have gratitude, I'm going to be thankful, but you act on it, it is the action of it that creates the gift, because our bodies feel it and our bodies remember. And so they did an action. They got into their cars and they did drive-bys. They're never going to forget that. They could talk about a drive-by. Chances are they would forget about it.
Right.
But the action, the embodiment of that action actually goes to the brain. The brain remembers and it becomes part of a memory.
Yeah.
And these memories, we've been telling some stories here today. And these stories are so important. Storytelling and remembering the past and bringing the past into the present and can really help us feel like we are actively giving back. We are not negating what was, and that's a gift.
Yeah.
And we are taking the past and bringing it into the present, and maybe even gifting that to our loved ones who's in a senior care facility. Like maybe you record a memory and you have them see it through Zoom, because a lot of the frontline staff in these facilities are allowing patients or members within their community that are there to listen or see their loved ones.
Yeah.
So you could record a memory.
I like what you said about what I was hearing in that, and I don't know if this is clinically accurate, Edie, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I think about the grief and the guilt as being a bit more passive and the gifts and the gratitude being more active.
Oh, I love that framework. Yes.
Yeah, because then at least when we're in that ability to take action, then we're able to focus and choose to focus on things that we do have the ability to influence and control. Where when we're stuck in that place of grief and guilt, it's almost immobilizing.
It is immobilizing completely. And if you don't have the gratitude and find the gifts, and you get stuck in the guilt and the grief, it becomes a great obstacle for you. And it is an obstacle and it's hard, for sure. But there are ways to quiet them so that you can get into gratitude, so that you can get into the gifts. And it's finding that balance between them. And they're passive. However, they can become guilt, and grief can become very, very active. And they are active and they get activated. They get activated, highly, highly activated. And how do you deal with their activation? By going into gratitude and by seeing what the gifts are.
Well, and it sounds like when you talk about it being activated, to me, that's a reactive place versus the gifts and the gratitude are proactive.
Yes. And they're brain changers. So part of this conversation is also talking about our brains. And, the brain is amazing. We are learning so much about the brain, right? I mean, in your field, in my field, and the dopamine that gets released when we are in gratitude and when we can see the gifts. Oh my God. Actually, that plasticity, all of those linkages, the depression linkages, the guilt linkages that go on in our brain, they get interrupted. And so gratitude is an interrupter within the brain that creates action. And it is our action. They feed off of one another. The activity of gratitude causes a change in the brain, and that change in the brain then allows us to make movements within our grief.
That is, it brings to light for me a funny story when I was in regular sessions with my therapist when I was going through the grief and the guilt with Ty living in long-term care. And so I was, probably moaning and complaining about, just whatever. And I stopped talking and she looks at me and she says, "So how did your move go?" Because I had just moved myself, the two kids and I, to our new home. And I remember looking at her thinking, you didn't hear a word I said. Like, why am I here? This is my inside voice, of course.
Yeah.
And I said to her, well, it went fairly smooth and I had this person helping me and so I started describing it. And I'm watching her looking at me as I'm telling this story and she's getting this little smirk on her face. And I didn't catch on at the time what she was doing, but she was shifting my focus and shifting me to talk about something that I had made happen, right? That I had influence and control over, and felt really grateful that I was able to get the kids, the pets, myself moved and settled and starting to rebuild. And so I'm assuming that was a technique that she used on me.
But well, it might have been a technique, or it might have been the moment begged for your brain to change a little bit and to see what you're doing, to see, wow, look, yes, you're grieving and you're having a very hard time, and that's true. And it's also true that you're out there and you moved with your kids and you packed up and you did all of these things while you were also grieving. And so it's maybe you needed to compartmentalize a little bit, and yet you were still very much alive in your actions and you were following through, which reminds me of a client that I've been working with. And this is a guy who's well into his 80s and he's a half empty kind of guy, glass half empty, like, my glass is half empty always. And his wife of 60 years passes away and he's like, I can't do anything. And so we go through the steps of the day. Did you sleep last night? Yeah. Did you have breakfast? Yeah. Did you go to work? Yeah, I go to work all the time. This was before COVID. Did you work out? Yeah. I'm like, wow. I don't know. That sounds pretty full to me. And he's like, oh, no. You mean I'm not as bad as I thought I was? You mean I'm going to have to give up my glass half empty point of view? Like, well, maybe they could live side by side. Glass half full, glass half empty. So yes, we can grieve and then we can see, you know what? I don't have to show my love by not realizing how well I'm doing.
I love what I heard was, I just saw a big ampersand, that that you can have the grief and the guilt and also appreciate the fullness of the life that you're having, and that they can coexist. And ideally you want to be focusing more on the this than that.
That's right.
But there is an ability to coexist and perhaps adjust the volume that you are hearing and the temperature that you're feeling with all of those different emotions.
So true. And there's something that you just did that's really important. And it ties into the question you asked. So, like, what do you do with the guilt? And what do you do with the grief? You actively listened. And then you reframed what I said. And if you have a partner who is in full out grief and guilt, you can reframe, or you can ask a question. And just by listening, you're helping them.
That's helpful. Well, I am so grateful, first of all, that we met a year ago
Oh,
and
yeah.
have established this connection and this friendship. And I'm really grateful that you're so generous, which would be our fifth G, I suppose. So generous to be sharing your wisdom and knowledge with the people that I'm working to serve during this challenging time. And I hope we can continue these conversations and share them.
I hope so too. And yes, I'm so glad that our paths crossed a year ago. And we never know the gifts we'll find because of a choice to grow.
Exactly. Love that. That's a quotable.
That's a quotable.
Right. Talk to
Okay.
you soon, Edie.
Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.